Myself and Captain Schrader are going to go through these. Our agenda today is going to discuss Letterman's prior military history, Letterman's appointment during the Civil War, current roles, care, planning, execution, and medical logistics operations, mitigate the impact of a rapid moving force, Maryland campaign, and the lessons learned. Prior to his military history, Dr. Letterman in 1849 from Jefferson Medical College of Philadelphia, graduated from there, and in 1949 was assistant surgeon to the Army Medical Department. And he also participated in a campaign with the Seminole Indians in 1959, and did a year at Fort Riley, Minnesota, and Fort Deference in New Mexico Territory to aid in the Apache campaign. Then he was transferred to Fort Monroe in Virginia, and in 1960 to 1961 he was engaged in California against the Utes. Utes.
Yep. So he's a pre-war surgeon.
He starts out he comes right out of med school, joins the military, and starts working immediately on a lot of campaigns. During the Civil War, at the start of the Civil War, he was assigned to the Army of the Potomac and the medical director of the Department of the West in Virginia in May of 1962. And a month later, the Surgeon General of the United States Army appointed him the rank of major as the medical director of the Army of the Potomac itself. In case anyone doesn't know what Dr. or Major Letterman looks like at that particular time, this is a photo of him, and I'll pass it around.
Okay, why is he a major? And he's the medical director for the whole Army of the Potomac, and he's only a major. Anybody know the answer to that question?
Time and service.
Not that important.
Because at this time there's only one grade
Above.
for a surgeon, and that's major. They don't care where you're working. You're a
So
surgeon, you're a
he
major.
was the Surgeon General at that time, right?
Nope, not a surgeon general.
Okay.
He is the medical director on Army of Potomac. But there's only one rank, and that's major. So he continues to be a major, whether he's a regimental surgeon all the way up to an Army surgeon. Still a major.
Didn't know that. That's great. One thing I just want to touch on very quickly, it'll tie in, but to some of you, it's kind of insignificant because you're in the medical field. But if someone else was here, I wanted to just kind of go into the roles of care. Role 1 care, it consists of care rendered at the unit level. It includes self-aid, buddy aid, CLS, examination, emergency saving procedures, and etc. There's a picture of Dr. Letterman. Role 2 is care includes physician directed.
So you're going to tell us who did that in the Civil War? Who did Role 1 in the Civil War?
In the Civil War, the Role 1 would have been done by the ambulatory care. I think he had a ground ambulance group that was there, and also there was some additional.
It's in the brief, sir.
Oh, it's okay.
Each
I'll
regiment had an aid station.
All right, if this, just tell me, you tell me to it. I'll wait.
All right, and the roles of care continued includes the physician-directed resuscitation, stabilization, and may include advanced trauma and management of patients. And role 3 and 4, I think I don't have to go any further. You get it. It kind of escalates from there, and then you eventually end up in role 4, which is rehabilitation and recovery therapy. The critical factors associated with the planning and execution, I think some of the ones that I touched on briefly was he obtained a charter, which is kind of the first time I think this has been brought up so far. He obtained a charter from the Army Commander Major General McClellan, which is very significant because he's getting his go-to-work agreement, and he's got free reign at this particular phase in the Civil War to create a real plan that the general is going to most likely sign off on. He recognized the medical services. He reorganizes the medical services by August of 1862, and devises a system of forward first aid stations at the regimental level. which that's very significant and kind of touches on what I spoke about the roads earlier. And he established a mobile field hospital to be located at the division and corps headquarters. And all these were connected by ambulance corps, which was horse and buggy style ambulance. Nothing that we would be used to today, but very similar in ways to how we use the ambulance corps today.
Let's go back a minute to this charter that he got from McClellan. You're absolutely right. You cannot overstate how important that was because it's essentially a blank check, right? And you guys probably read Letterman's writing. You notice he writes with authority. You don't see that up until this point by any surgeon at any level in the war. He writes with the full authority of the Army commander, and that was significant in him being able to do all the other things that you're talking about.
Yes, sir. What did Jonathan Letterman attempt to mitigate in the impact of rapid moving force and offensive? You know, first, this is kind of where you start to see some of the first principles of triage were instituted. At one point, I think there was a phase where it was like first come, first serve. You just kind of walk in and you be seen. By this phase, he really realizes the importance of, triage. That's brought to the forefront. Plan medical operations before the battle to treat the wounded more quickly. So pre-planning and makeshift general hospitals out of some of the hotel schools and other sites that we discussed earlier today, churches and etc. And created a robust independent ambulance corps, which we discussed a little bit earlier. From this point, I'm going to let Captain Schrader pick up from here.
In relation to the medical logistics operations, the novel concepts that Dr. Letterman tested during the Maryland campaign, one of them was before this, the Army reeled from inefficient treatment of casualties in the 7 days battle in June. As Major Border said, the casualties in the 7 days war were just left on the field for days. If they were wounded, they were either they had to be carried off by a buddy or found their way off the field, or they were going to die right there, or they suffered for days from their wounds if it was a minor wound. Before anybody even got to see them. This was for days, so that was not a good way to do it. Letterman saw that, and he wanted to implement a new plan in order for us to do that. And after the blank check from General McClellan, he gave him full authority to do anything he wanted to do. So, with his previous military history and seeing how everything else worked in the other campaigns, probably led him to come up with his ideas, and it's kind of went from there. In Frederick, Maryland, he selected it as a hospital center, also because of the locality of it, and also the transportation routes back down to Washington, D.C. for further care if needed. He also set up the two hospitals at Smoketown and Keedysville also, which were nearby here. So there was always a step forward going back to the more urgent, better care, I should say. By the Battle of Antietam in September, Letterman had devised a system of 4 aid stations at the regimental level, and he prepared the medical response in anticipation of casualties on a larger scale. Much more planned out than anything else. Some of the lessons learned by Letterman at Antietam influenced a lot of the medical logistics doctrine and operations. After the show of the proficiency of his medical procedures at this battle, he was eventually officially established as the medical procedure for the entirety of the United States Army by Act of Congress in March 1864. The Ambulance Corps Bill of 1864 became law. Which was essentially the Letterman ambulance plan was extended to all the armies. The Army Medical Department was to have privilege of choosing the enlisted men to be put on ambulance and a stretcher detail, and they could not be withdrawn from that detail. Some of the other things Letterman learned from this was he really needed to have a free-flowing chain of supply. As we talked about, the bridge got knocked out, so they weren't able to get medical supplies across to support the hospitals on this side of the river, which really hindered things. So on the other side of the house is they were also competing, just like we do now, against all the other classes of supply when it comes to things. They actually established the ambulance corps was also transportation for medical supplies in the need of doing so. So that's what the ambulance corps was specifically only used to take patients from the battlefield to the hospitals and medical supplies back. That's what they do, just like we do now.
So Letterman had some, I don't know if you read this, but he had some very, very harsh words for officers who misappropriated his wagons.
He did, and that's one of the reasons why he, again, as you said, sir, he the way he wrote what needed to be done and how things were going to be done. That's why he wrote it that way, because of people basically saying, "Oh, you're just a surgeon, go away."
Yep.
That's how it kind of feels. Of course, we also mentioned that they established divisions at the hospitals at the division level. As we also mentioned, there was a surgeon in charge of each of the hospitals. There was an assistant surgeon who was in charge of supplies, and then another surgeon was always identified as a record keeping. At the battle of Antietam, where we were first at on the first field that we walked through, they set up a hospital there, and casualties there was no tracking there. That's what he was actually able to kind of, what I was reading about. Patient care, they didn't really know who was there, who was not there, and it took a while to get that information with also the supplies. With that, he actually also changed the idea of how to set it up so that there will always be somebody who was in charge of the patient records and tracking of who's in, who's coming out, in and out of that hospital.
To the point that, you remember when we went by the Keating farm this morning? I told you the beautiful crystal spring is there. That was the hospital after the battle. The surgeon who was in charge of that hospital kept extensive notes. He didn't just keep records of the patient. He kept detailed notes about the patient. So you can go back today as a researcher, because his book still exists. You can go back and read that, and it is absolutely amazing how detailed his records were.
And the last thing was, of course, we've already mentioned, was the separation of the medical supplies from everything else, so that they don't have a constriction when it comes to getting their supplies where they need it to go.
Questions? Very good.
Didn't he also come up with